Welcome to the Relationship Talk Show, the space where we explore love, attraction, and human behavior through psychology and real-life experiences, not fantasies or movie scripts. Today, we are initiating a deep dive into, I think, one of the most psychologically taxing dynamics of modern relationships, the unexplained fade-out. We're going to be looking at the mechanics of why that intense initial interest can just vanish, leaving only silence behind. And crucially, why that one critical piece of communication, the goodbye, is so often missing. This dive is really designed to get past the immediate emotional sting and instead focus on clarity and behavioral science.
That is precisely the mission for our listener, the learner. We are aiming for awareness and really objective understanding. When you can grasp the underlying psychological patterns, the predictable nature of this inconsistent behavior, you can stop internalizing these outcomes. We want to equip you with the knowledge to recognize the reliable signals, the internal motivations. And that helps shift the focus from what did I do wrong to something more productive, like what is the data telling me about this dynamic?
Okay, let's unpack this immediately because I feel like the vast majority of frustration we see in dating comes from this one fundamental contradiction. There's this huge disconnect between what people say they want, connection, commitment, communication, and how their actions actually unfold over time. So why? Why is there such a persistent gap between the words and the behavior?
Well, our sources suggest this isn't usually about a moral failing or some kind of intentional deception. It's more often a manifestation of cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, people genuinely hold the aspiration for a healthy, committed relationship. That's their verbal, their conscious intention. But their internal reality, which is maybe unconscious, it conflicts with that. They might fear vulnerability, they might lack the emotional bandwidth for consistency, or, simply haven't processed past relational wounds.
So it's like they're selling themselves on an idealized script, but their emotional system just won't cash the check. If someone texts you, "I'm incredibly excited about where this is going," but then takes 24 hours to respond to a simple question, which do you trust, the promise or the pause?
The pause. Always the pause. We have to treat demonstrated behavior as the most reliable metric of emotional bandwidth and priority. The words are the promise, the actions, or the lack of action. That's the ledger.
That's a great way to put it, the ledger.
Emotional withdrawal and silence are powerful nonverbal communications that directly override any stated intentions. That internal conflict we just discussed, that dissonance, it almost always expresses itself first through declining effort.
Declining effort. Let's focus on that. Or effort imbalance, because that's a measurable objective data point that you can actually track.
Exactly. Effort imbalance is a concrete, observable signal that behavior is diverging from the professed interest. If one person is consistently initiating contact, planning the dates, showing active, high-quality engagement, while the other one is just sort of passively participating or reciprocating with minimal energy,
Right.
the delta in effort, it signals a fundamental difference in priority and investment level. And it doesn't matter how affectionate their last text was.
So the person putting in less effort is basically signaling that the relationship holds a lower value in their life right now.
That's exactly it.
It sounds like the first lesson here for the learners to just stop negotiating with the behavior based on the words.
Huh.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, how does understanding this gap help you move forward?
It provides focus. It allows you to shift from trying to interpret vague hope to just reading reliable metrics. You're no longer asking, are they lying to me? But instead, you're asking, is their observable investment sufficient to build a healthy reciprocal dynamic?
And that objective analysis is so liberating.
It is.
That transition is absolutely key. Okay, now let's pivot our focus to the fuel driving these dynamics. The sources reveal a deeper mechanism at play here, and it's all related to attention. So how does attention function as a currency in attraction?
Attention is the ultimate signal of value. It's the primary catalyst for emotional investment. When we allocate our finite resources, our focus, our time, our presence, our responsiveness to one person, we are effectively underwriting their emotional significance in our lives.
So you're granting them emotional power.
You're granting them emotional power.
Yeah.
And the dynamic is particularly sensitive in the early stages of dating because that power can shift so rapidly based on who is providing or withholding that resource. The withdrawal of consistent high-quality attention, it creates an emotional vacuum, and crucially, it triggers the recipient's need to regain that signal of value.
And isn't that craving for attention, and the supply becomes inconsistent, exactly where the emotional investment accelerates? It almost becomes addictive.
You've hit on a fascinating psychological mechanism the sources explore. It's called intermittent or variable reinforcement.
Like a slot machine.
It's the exact same principle that powers slot machines. When attention is initially abundant, 100% reinforcement, we kind of take it for granted. But when that attention becomes inconsistent, sometimes they respond immediately, sometimes they disappear for hours, that uncertainty, it increases the urgency. The brain becomes hyper-focused on seeking the next hit of positive reinforcement.
That explains so much. It's why the silent treatment or the slow fade is often so emotionally effective even though it's so painful. The less effort they give, the more valuable and thus more preoccupying they become because scarcity has triggered a pursuit response.
Exactly. The emotional investment in the relationship often becomes less about the quality of the connection itself and more about just securing that consistent reward, the attention that has now been deliberately or unconsciously rationed.
And we see this little laboratory of shifting power dynamics played out most visibly right on our screens. So let's use texting behavior as our primary example. What does that subtle shift in responsiveness tell us about the reallocation of attention?
Texting is a high-resolution measurement of this attention currency. Initially, responses are often enthusiastic, detailed, rapid, reflecting a high investment priority. The shift from that rapid engagement to sparse, delayed replies, it's not just poor etiquette. It is a measurable reduction in emotional energy. It signals that the recipient has been moved down the internal priority list.
So the pace tells the story.
The pace tells the story. If you're used to responses within the hour and suddenly they're arriving 8 or 12 hours later with one-word answers, that gap is the physical manifestation of emotional withdrawal. The person has deprioritized you. They're no longer willing to spend the emotional currency that's required for sustained, high-quality engagement.
So we've established that actions, especially the flow of attention and effort, they speak volumes, and they often contradict the words. Now let's tie this all together. Why does interest fade? And crucially, why does it happen so often without the expected courtesy of a verbal goodbye? Why the classic fade out?
The fade out is, at its psychological core, the avoidance of emotional discomfort and accountability.
Right.
It's the silent manifestation of that emotional withdrawal we were just discussing. The decision to fade is often rooted in a person's internal inability to articulate complex, messy feelings. Things like ambivalence, fear, or just a lack of chemistry that they struggle to even define themselves.
But doesn't labeling it psychological avoidance risk? You're just excusing what is essentially rudeness. What do our sources say about the ethical expectations here?
That's a really necessary clarification. While the behavior is certainly perceived as rude or disrespectful, our analysis is focusing on the motivation, not the judgment of it. And the motivation is self-preservation through conflict avoidance. Providing a clear explanation requires emotional labor. It means managing the other person's potential disappointment, anger, or sadness. And for someone who is already emotionally checked out, the path of least immediate resistance is simply to disappear. They let the decline in effort serve as the unspoken breakup.
Unspoken, but...
Yeah, and this is compounded by the low friction of modern dating. When relationships are casual, the perceived obligation to provide closure is minimal. That makes avoidance a very easy default. The silence confirms that the individual is prioritizing their own temporary comfort over the recipient's need for clarity.
So the lack of an explanation is often less about contempt for the other person and more about the individual's profound discomfort with their own emotional state and the challenge of communicating nuanced negative feelings. So they let the communication decay because they just can't face the confrontation.
Precisely. And we need to be clear. This behavior is rooted in psychological avoidance and, frankly, difficulty with emotional maturity. It's not necessarily malice. The person is likely struggling with their own internal conflict, and rather than resolving it through dialogue, they simply remove themselves from the conflict zone.
I appreciate that distinction. Understanding the mechanism allows us to process the event without absorbing unnecessary guilt or blame. Let's go a bit deeper into the mechanics. What's fascinating to me is how often these relationship outcomes, the imbalance, the sudden fade, are the result of emotional patterns that people repeat unconsciously, regardless of who they're dating.
This is really the pinnacle of the deep dive. We are talking about ingrained patterns, often rooted in early attachment styles. A person might consciously desire deep intimacy, but if they have an avoidant attachment style, as soon as the relationship reaches a certain threshold of emotional closeness, their internal alarm system just triggers.
And that closeness feels like a threat to their autonomy.
It feels like a threat, exactly.
So how does that internal wiring then manifest in observable behavior like the fade out?
The avoidant pattern is often a cycle. They feel drawn to closeness, but once the dynamic shifts to consistent connection, they start to feel engulfed or suffocated. So the unconscious response is to suddenly withdraw their attention and emotional effort, initiating the fade out to reestablish that comfortable, familiar emotional distance.
So they're just repeating a learned response.
They're repeating a learned response to vulnerability because it's familiar, even though it completely sabotages their conscious goal of commitment.
Wow. That explains the baffling speed of the reversal. They seemed perfect, consistent, enthusiastic, and then overnight, they just become cold or distant. The closeness itself was the trigger for the withdrawal.
Yes, the speed is a defensive reflex. They weren't lying about their interest initially, but their emotional system defaulted to a self-protective mechanism once the relationship became too real or required too much emotional presence. And this pattern, this repetition, it means the fade-out isn't really about you. It's about their deep-seated, learned response to vulnerability and intimacy.
That brings us directly to application. Based on this deeper understanding of human behavior and these unconscious patterns, what lessons can you apply immediately to protect your emotional energy?
The immediate application is a radical focus on consistency and reciprocity. Stop waiting for the verbal confirmation of the end.
Okay.
If the behavioral data points, the consistency, the effort, the responsiveness, if they show a sustained and dramatic decrease, you have to recognize that the relationship has already concluded for the other person. It doesn't matter whether they've articulated it or not.
The relationship is already over.
It's over. Promoting clarity and awareness means recognizing that data. If the shift in attention is dramatic and the effort imbalance is persistent, trust that signal. This realization saves an immense amount of emotional energy that would otherwise be spent analyzing their vague words or waiting for a courtesy that their psychology prevents them from providing.
It sounds like the most valuable lesson is realizing that when the behavior doesn't match the words, you already have the answer you need to move on. The psychological cost of waiting for that verbal closure is just far higher than the cost of simply accepting the behavioral signal.
Absolutely. Accepting the behavioral truth is the strongest emotional boundary you can set. Relationships often reveal more about our psychology than our intentions. The more awareness we gain, the better choices we make, not just in love, but in life.
If this deep dive gave you clarity and helped you understand these complex dynamics, please consider supporting our work by liking this episode and subscribing to the Relationship Talk Show. Turn on that notification bell and let us know in the comments what relationship topic we should discuss next. Thank you for joining us for this crucial deep dive into the psychology of modern dating. We'll talk to you next time.